Good evening, everyone. My name is Hugh Cole. I'm one of the directors of the International Growth Centre. I'm the Director of Country Programs for the International Growth Centre, the IGC, which is hosting this talk this evening. The International Growth Centre is a partnership between the London School of Economics and Oxford University. We aim to provide demand-led policy advice based on frontier research. So we both commission research and we do policy engagement. We have teams in over 13 countries and projects in many more countries than that. One of the themes of the IGC works on 4 broad areas, and one of those is cities. And we have a very active research agenda in that area, and lots of engagements with government, national and city governments in the countries where we work. Based on that work, we've initiated a new program of outreach called Cities That Work, which aims to use the evidence that is generated by research skillfully, in a different way to what we've done before, to engage policymakers and to get, to have a much more of a dialogue with policymakers and to help spread ideas in the policy space. And Ed will talk more about the vision and the key policy areas this evening. So we're very lucky to have Professor Ed Glaeser, who's going to be speaking to us tonight. So I'll just introduce him briefly, and then I also will introduce Tony Venables, Professor Tony Venables, who will be a discussant this evening. Our running order will be that Ed will speak for about 40 minutes, Ed? And Tony will, as a discussant, will reflect for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers about half an hour for that. So just briefly to introduce, Ed is going to be speaking on the topic of making cities work in the developing world. Professor Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics and the Director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government at Harvard University. He's also the Research Program Director for the IGC Cities Research Program, and he's the chair of this new Cities That Work initiative that we're establishing. Tony Venables, Professor Tony Venables, Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford and the Director of the Center for the Analysis of Resource-Rich Economies, and he's also a steering group member of the International Growth Center. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Tony. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming and giving me your precious time tonight. I should say, first of all, in terms of my somewhat extreme neckwear, this was Nava Ashraf's doing. She insisted that I randomize over the ties that I'm wearing, and we're going to see what impact it has on your ex-post research productivity. So you're all part of this natural experiment. Cities That Work is, as was just said, it's not a replacement for IGC Cities. It is the next step for IGC Cities. It is an attempt to create something that brings together the research side of this with an outreach program to engage city leaders throughout the world. And I think for those of us who are passionate about developing world cities, it is quite possible to do work that is published in top-tier journals, that is completely compatible with our research goals, and also do things that are quite valuable for the developing world. In some sense, as we think about the cities of the developing world, they're places of both remarkable opportunity, right, and enormous challenges. And they call for much more functional local government in lots of different ways. And research can and should be part of that. And I just want to stress, when we think about what research is good on this, what is valuable on this, we want to be listening to local leaders and hearing what they have to say, but we don't want them to be dictating our research agenda, right? We need to use our judgment as researchers and figure out what things fit together as bridges between the world of research and the world of policymaking. Oh, that's bad. Let's see if I can figure out how to use this. Okay. The way this is going to work is there's going to be a bit of an outline of the Cities That Work agenda, and then I'm going to be fitting in with little bits of papers that I've been working on lately, papers that are new. So in some cases, they may be a little bit frustrating in terms of how little I'm giving you of the papers, but in some sense, the key here is to sort of emphasize how research fits together with policymaking. So I'm going to start with a new paper that is joint with Matthew Kahn, and that's mostly meant to motivate why urbanization in the developing world. So I start with a quote from Burke and Miguel's paper in PNAS, I guess, which is their estimates of the impact of global warming on conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. So their estimate is that the historical response to temperature suggests a roughly 54% increase in armed conflict incidents by 2030, or an additional 39,000 battle deaths, 393,000 battle deaths if future wars are as deadly as recent wars. The question that Khan and I set out to give some information on is, will urbanization moderate or make that, that prediction even worse? And just to start with a relatively unconvincing regression answer to this, let's take the classic Burke and Miguel regressions. So we're regressing the propensity to have a civil war in the country on the temperature level. And the first two regressions are simply reproducing their core results. So it's 1% increase is associated with a 1 degree increase in temperature is associated with a 5% increase in whether or not there's a civil war. And then let's interact that with how urbanized the country is at some time period, at some initial time period. And what you see in the third regression is essentially that relationship completely disappears if the country is in the top quartile of sub-Saharan Africa and countries in terms of urbanization. Now, what this interaction cannot tell you about is whether or not this is about urbanization per se or other measures of development. Those things are way too highly correlated. The top quarter in terms of urbanization are pretty much also the top quarter in terms of other measures of development. But it does suggest that the negative impact that temperature has appears to be moderated by urbanization and development. The fourth regression shows the interaction with just a linear measure for the degree of urbanization. And again, this shows that the effect disappears at about 60% urbanization. So the negative effect disappears at that point. Now, there are a number of theoretical ideas, and much of what we do in the paper is actually theory. It's a spatial equilibrium model with a bunch of bells and whistles put on to give you starvation risk, climate risk, creating more conflict, and suggesting different ways in which urbanization might moderate that. So the Miguel hypothesis, the Burke-Miguel hypothesis, is that climate change creates desperation, which increases conflict. It certainly is a possibility. It's one interpretation of what's going on with their regressions. Here are a number of corollaries to that, which come naturally out of a model with urbanization. One, if urbanization creates integration into global markets, it then creates a hedge against climate change. So if you believe that climate change is going to have winners and losers globally, so unquestionably greater heat in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa is going to mean that subsistence farming becomes far less profitable, but it may well increase the success of farmers in Siberia or Canada. If you're part of the global trading system, then that's hedged out. If you're on your own and doing subsistence agriculture, then it's not. So that's effect one. Effect two is urbanization increases land per capita in the rural sector. If that's so, then this will mean less desperation and less violence. Now, whether or not this is an externality or not depends upon what you think about property rights in the rural sector. So if land is actually owned and priced in a market mechanism, then this does not create an externality from urbanization. If land is shared, as in the case in many developing world rural areas, then in fact this creates an externality from urbanization. Because in fact the people who leave the farms don't in fact internalize the fact that they're freeing up more land to make available to other people. Urban corollary three. And this relates to a central theme that has gone through, let's say, Paul Collier's work 20 years ago on violence and natural resources. Think about a hierarchy of appropriability across products. So diamonds are the easiest to steal and appropriate. Hence, they are an invitation to violence. Herding animals, as argued by Nisbet and Cohen, are somewhat less appropriable, but they're pretty appropriable, right? They're mobile. And this is the work when Nisbet and Cohen argued that cultures of violences came up in cultures that depended upon herding as opposed to cultures that depended upon crops. This was the point that they were making. That in fact, it was the appropriability of this wealth that led towards more violence. Third, crops. Crops are a little bit harder to steal. But in fact, one argument that's made is in fact governments and theft, and in fact the urbanization that comes from excess wealth only comes from crops that are storable. So this is the hypothesis that said grain cultures made it possible to have wealthy nobles who stole and then set up cities in a way that cultures based on legumes did not, because in fact the water content in those alternative vegetables made them harder to steal and to appropriate. Then you get to capital in cities, which is harder for other people to use, and then of course human capital, which is virtually impossible for anyone to steal and expropriate. This argues that urbanization moves us from appropriable commodities, which are easier to steal, to less appropriable ones, and again acts as a deterrence on violence. Incidentally, if you believe that view, it also offers an explanation for the Steven Pinker fact about why violence has been declining in human history, if we have generally moved from more appropriable commodities to less appropriable commodities over history. Urban correlation 4 is if urbanites invest in government that spills over to rural areas, conflict will fall. Okay? And this is the idea that cities have, and this is of course a running theme of cities that work, cities have these painful negative externalities that absolutely cry out for local government. These create strong incentives for urbanites to invest in an effective state that will police the downsides of density. Sometimes perhaps those policing efforts may spill out to the penumbras of cities and may actually create safe spaces around them. There is, of course, a countervailing force, which is if you think that the peaceful farmers flee first, that they're the first refugees to cities, and you still leave the same stock of aggressors left in the rural areas, then you have a countervailing force, which is, in fact, the life of the peaceful farmer gets worse because they're more likely to be a target since the other ones have left. Okay. One more thing on this government view, this comes from a recent paper of mine with Bryce Steinberg, is something that we've called the Boston hypothesis, which is this notion that urbanization is related to improvements in government. And indeed, when you think about the growing cities of the developing world in places that are both poor and poorly governed, one question is whether or not these places will stop being poorly governed if the rural life continues. And the Boston hypothesis is, at least hypothetically, it's possible that cities will actually lead towards more government. The Boston hypothesis itself focuses on one channel, which is the ability of cities to topple dictators. But there are several, okay? So one of which is, the first of which is cities enable coordinated revolts against dictators who are nearby, right? So particularly in capital cities. So history is completely on the side of this one. We have 2,500 years of urban crowds getting together and kicking people out, whether or not we're talking about Lucius Junius Brutus toppling the last Tarquin king, right, 2,500 years ago, or we're talking about Paris in 1789, or Tahrir Square 6 years ago. The track record of urban crowds doing this is pretty straightforward. We also have regressions on this, and the guy I'm citing here is Wallace, whose book is on Will Urbanization Pose a Threat to the Chinese Leaders? And he has regressions which, many of us who have actually looked at the relationship between urbanization and revolutions and coups have missed this, which is if you look across all countries between the relationship between urbanization and revolutions and coups, you find nothing. Right? But that's primarily because the more urbanized places are more likely to be democratic to start off with. If you focus just on dictatorships, you get actually a very large effect that actually urbanization leads towards more revolutions. Now, what's less obvious is once you've had the revolution, you actually get a democracy following, right? And certainly Tahrir Square leads us to question whether or not that will occur. The second variant is cities create a specific demand for different types of government. And when you think about what cities do, they create opportunities for economic interactions that should create a demand for a certain type of freedom, but at the same time they create a demand for government that will restrict these negative externalities associated with density. So in some sense, the governments that you would expect if they were catering to urban needs to emerge are ones that clamp down on certain types of freedoms, right? Social activities, and ratchet up economic freedoms. Now, that in fact is exactly the Singapore model. Right? So the Singapore model is exactly one that says, look, do whatever economic activity you want, but sure as heck don't chew any gum. Okay? That may well, we may or may not like that model, but it does suggest a more effective government that may be able to police local neighborhoods as well. The third variant, which I don't really believe, but it's kind of nice to think about, is that cities create civic virtues, the ability to work with other people. And this is a whole model that sort of Europe develops Republican democratic governments because the urbanites of the Low Countries develop this civic capital that then first enables them to throw off control of the Habsburg monarchs of Spain and then set up their own government. I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support this, in fact, in terms of broader stuff. There's no sense in which urbanites in the developing world show a lot of civic virtues relative to lower density dwellers, but it remains there as at least a possibility. In my paper with Khan, we go through a variety of simulations on this. So there are some externalities from urbanization, and they're both positive and negative. So there's the positive externality of increasing land per capita in rural areas. There's land per capita reducing starvation risk, and if Burke and Miguel are right, reducing conflict risk. Increasing density in the city is going to create negative spillovers unless tamed by government. Even if tamed, there's a negative externality from urbanizing, which is the price of paying for all this government. And then there's a positive externality, which is if there's some spillover from those investments, it then pays off for the rural areas as well. And this is the type of simulation that comes out. So this red line shows the welfare in the city if you have an effective government, meaning the costs of organizing a government are low. This is if you have an ineffective government. And this is the type of thing that we have in mind, that there's a negative effect on urban welfare of increasing city size. There's a positive effect on rural welfare. But of course, the negative effect is much higher if governments are ineffective than if they are effective. Two more facts on this violence fact. We've taken the geocoded conflict data for Sub-Saharan Africa, and we've classified them as urban versus rural. One of the facts that comes out very clearly in the data over the last 20 years is a declining share of violence that's in urban areas over time. So if you had a view that the cities in Sub-Saharan Africa were getting better at policing violence, that would be supported by the data. We also have some regressions, which you're not going to be able to read very well, and which I don't really believe as much, which is the first four regressions are looking at the impact of a national conflict on violence within 3 miles of the city. The next ones are looking at conflict between 3 and 50 miles of the city. And what you can see from this is when there's a national conflict, at least now, it's much more likely to spill over in violence that's away from the city center than violence that's close towards the city center. So this is to be continued, but this again relates to this issue of whether or not cities can play a larger role for national transformation. Now, the Cities that Work mission is really in some sense a response to that. It's about how can we use the power of academic research to enable the governments of developing world cities to become stronger, to become more effective, to deal with the demons that come with density. We have our outputs are supposed to be white papers, which are starting to be produced, web pages, and a variety of different meetings, interactions with local leaders. And there are two African leaders who are on the steering committee of Cities that Work. We have 4 major intellectual themes. This sometimes goes up and down between 4 and 6, but they always contain the same topics, whether or not we group them together or not. Land use and property rights. So that's one, and we just heard some great presentations related to that early on. Housing and infrastructure, so this is the built environment. Firms and employment, and financing and strengthening city government. And I should say the one that is overwhelmingly of interest to local leaders is how am I going to get more money, right? This 4th one, the financing side, is by far the easiest way into City Hall. This is the one that they care about most. So economists are mad for land use and property rights. So we love this stuff, and there are good reasons for loving this stuff. So we've got a lot of a strong case for allocating property rights. And there are a variety of different arguments. So Hernando de Soto argued about the importance of being able to use well-defined property rights as leverage and to enable borrowing, which will then fuel firm formation. Erica Field, of course, has her terrific paper showing that people spend less time protecting their land when they have clear title over it. There's the misallocation problem. And this is one that Paul Collier and Tony have particularly emphasized in developing world slums, that you have very high value land in slums that is right near to the city center. And you think in some case there's a great Coasian bargain to be struck where the people who live in those land trade it, get lots of money, locate some other area, and everyone is made better off, and they can't. And the paper that I've noted of mine, which it feels close to me, is the nature of rent control in developed world cities. So what rent control means is that you have a right to a unit at a low price, but you can't sell it. You can't trade that apartment. And consequently, you can show that people who often live in rent-controlled apartments don't look like the people who should be living in those apartments. So small families living in large apartments, people whose kids have gone out living in large apartments because they can't trade it, because they can't reallocate it. It's exactly the same issue as people who have a weak property title associated with it, as opposed to a strong one, which enables them to trade. And fourth, and this is one of, I think a central thing that economists have probably paid less attention to, property rights, well-defined property rights, enable governments to impose obligations on owners. The history of creating regulations around water and sewage depends upon putting obligations on owners, putting requirements that you connect to sewerage systems, that you actually have decent water connections. If you don't know who owns the title in some formal sense, you can't impose that obligation. Similarly, you want to raise money from a property tax, which many of us believe is a particularly efficient way to raise money. It's very hard if you don't know who owns the land. Now, we're weaker on the tools for allocating property rights. So we're weaker in terms of knowing how this works. And often, we imagine that there's a world in which there are formal institutions which protect property rights and informal institutions are worthless, are blah, right? It's not true. Most of the time, and again, this was one of the presentations we heard earlier, but it's a well-established fact, most of the time, whether or not people in developing world cities have formal title or informal title, they feel reasonably equally protected against expropriation. And the expropriation they fear most, in most cases, is the expropriation by the state, not by other private people. If you did think that it was crucial to allocate formal property rights, you face two problems, and the paper that I'm going to talk about is on the second. The first is on the allocation problem. And this is a problem that says you have a bunch of people in a slum. They all say they have some right. Maybe multiple people claim that they have rights over the same property. How is it that you solve the allocation problem? This is not a new problem in the West. Henry II faced this problem after the Civil War in England in the 1840s, where the whole institution of the jury was used, and these were then supposed to be local worthies who knew the situation. The whole institution of the jury rose up in order to solve this problem, in order to figure out who owned the land at the time of his grandfather, Henry I, before the Civil War brought chaos. The second problem is the protection problem. How is it that we actually maintain these property rights once we have actually established it? And I'm going to mention briefly the results of a recent paper of mine with Andre Schleifer and Giacomo Ponzetto on this issue. This is going to specifically relate to designing institutions in a world in which courts are weak. One of the great problems of the entire law and economics edifice in economics, it has been designed around the fiction that courts work perfectly. Courts do not work perfectly in the United States. They may not even work perfectly in the United Kingdom, although I'm not offering any formal opinions on this. They certainly do not work perfectly in the developing world. These come from the World Justice Project's the World Justice Project contains surveys of both experts and ordinary citizens. And this asks people who are involved in the legal system, in the fraction of cases that they do, what share of those cases have the poor been treated unfairly relative to the rich? Now, this is less extreme, in fact, than other questions that they ask, like in what fraction of the cases that you deal with has some undue influence been brought on the court, right? In those cases, the numbers in poor world countries are 100%, right? That there are no cases they imagine in which subversion has not occurred. Here, you're only getting to 80. Oops. Oh, crap. Maybe I should just use this one. So here in countries like Malawi and Cambodia, you're getting to 90%. There also are places where you sort of think that maybe these experts have an extreme view of this. So Australian legal experts, who often skew perhaps a little to the left, have the view that their institutions, which are not notably thought to be subverted, also treat the poor quite unfairly. But the relationship with income is extremely strong, as you can tell. That in fact, the poorer the country, the more these experts believe that their courts are doing a terrible job of protecting poor people, which make you think that in some sense the point of legal institutions, of formal ones and informal ones, is to protect the poor against the weak, is to protect the weak against the strong. Because in fact the strong are going to be able to figure out how to manipulate the system no matter what. Now, the thing that Andre and Giacomo and I focus on is a very particular means of protecting rights. And it's a means of protecting rights that's relevant for property and also for contracts. These two means are standard in the law and economics literature. And one is called a property or an injunction-based relief, and one is called a liability-based relief. And I want you to just imagine that you own a piece of land, and there's some company that has decided to start mining on your property without your permission, okay? And it's causing you a bit of a heartache, and you don't particularly want it. So what is the difference between a property or injunction-based relief do versus a liability rule? A liability rule means that the court comes in and they assess how much damage you've suffered, and they say the company needs to pay you that money back, okay? Injunction or property relief says either the injunction means you just get to kick the company out, they have to stop doing it, or in extreme versions, they're criminally liable for doing something without your permission. Another version would be in the crime of timber trespass, where someone steals your wood. And in fact, we were talking earlier about an example of a property owner who wood was being taken down. In the case of an injunction, in the case of a property rule, that person could go to jail for stealing your wood. In the case of liability, they'd be fined a few £100s. Right? So it's a very different standard, and one that is actually, liability is much more informationally intensive. There's a parallel in contracts. Okay? Contracts, the norm in common law countries is essentially a liability rule, which means that if you have someone screwed up in a contract with you, they're required to pay you something. You're allowed to seek damages. The parallel for injunction is what's called specific performance, which means that they got to do it. They got to fulfill the thing. Courts usually don't like doing that because it requires a heavy burden on the courts. They actually need to follow the person and do it. So typically we have damages in the US, but interestingly, the market chiefs that we've been looking at in Zambia, who actually enforce contracts in these markets, they're perfectly free to engage in specific performance. They'll go, some guy isn't fulfilling a contract, they'll walk up and they'll tell the guy, look, you got to do it. Now we're going to bust some heads. We're going to make sure that this thing happens. So it's clear that in other areas, institutions often have evolved in ways that actually require specific performance. Now, there is a major difference in terms of the two, in terms of their risks from subversion. And liability rules are much easier to subvert in both directions than property rules. Property rules just involve a judgment as to whether or not this was your land and whether or not they're there on it without your permission. That needs to be established regardless of what's going, both for liability rules and for property rules. But liability rules require the added burden of actually assessing how much damage has been done. And there's a long history of people on different sides pushing those damages in one direction versus another. So, for example, the famous Peavey House case in the US is one in which a powerful mining company convinced the court that the damage that it was doing to a family that had contracted it was pennies on the dollar, right? So they paid nothing. On the other side, courts of oye and termine were used in 14th century England for people to ruin their opponents by claiming that their trespass on their land, right, constituted thousands of pounds worth of damage. So you could get one of these special courts around and basically charge the heck out of whoever it was that was involved with you. Our view is that the downsides of subversion will be limited by small claims courts. So if you have limits on the size of claims, you then have a limit on how bad this appropriation will be, which may be why small claims courts may be a natural way to bring some liability into the developing world. So our model suggests that when there is enough subversion of justice, you really want to use property rules rather than liability rules. You want the simpler, tougher, non-informationally intensive version of this. The way to think about the trade-off is that a property rule, if you have the ability to bargain, a property rule always leads towards the cozy and best outcome, right? You can bargain ex ante. It doesn't matter, as long as it's well defended, co's rules. If you can't bargain, you get too little takings. So that's why law and economics experts have liked liability rules. So if we're not able to bargain ex ante, you come up, you've got some great advantage from tromping all over my territory, right? But I'm not there, so you're just going to march across my area and do it. So you get too little of these takings in cases where you don't have bargaining. The downside, of course, of liability is you have subversion by the powerful. That in fact you have cases in which there are takings that occur that shouldn't occur. So it's a trade-off between how often you think bargaining occurs and how much subversion you think occurs when you're thinking about this. And it's true for subversion going on in both areas as well. I will not walk you through my favorite theorem of the paper, which is called the Rotten Chief Theorem, which is an homage to Gary Becker's Rotten Kid Theorem. I will also not walk you through that. But this is basically, over here you have subversion by the person who owns the property. This is, so this is subversion by the taker. This is subversion by the person who owns the property. They're basically three regions. When you have a low probability of subversion, you use compensation, a high probability you use injunction. And when they both are great at subverting everything, then you just give up. Then there's no recourse. You basically can't use the courts for anything because they become useless. Okay, so this is our attempt to do something that's entirely targeted towards an academic journal, but we think there are insights that are relevant for design of developing world institutions, for how we actually protect things. In fact, specifically to our world of thinking about the market chiefs who are doing property versus liability, what does this mean? And in contracts, the key is if you have institutions that are highly subvertible, like specific performance without, perhaps like compensation without caps, then it actually has this very clear prediction that people can only write contracts with people with similar levels of power. Okay, so you cannot have the mighty contracting with the strong with the weak if the weak know that whatever goes to the courts, they will be completely abused in it. So it gives an explanation about why weak market actors can only contract with other weak market actors and can't actually access deals with the large outside institutions. Okay, housing and infrastructure. There are lots of things to say about this. In some sense, this is the most exciting area of research in developing world cities. Thinking about, I continue to think that thinking about sewers is the high point of where research will be in urban stuff over the next 20 years in terms of the developing world. This is a world that is both about engineering and about institutions and about incentives. So the institutions are a question of what type of entity should provide these forms of infrastructure. The incentives are a question as to how should we get people to actually adopt them. So I'll just put up, and then knowing something about engineering is also absolutely crucial here. So I'll just highlight a couple of things here. First of all, when you think about institutions, there's actually a rich menu. And this comes from an Oxford Review of Economic Policy paper that I wrote for, I guess, Tony and Paul. These are 4 types of institutions that we've seen throughout recent history. 2 public, 2 private. So the public are integrated versus independent. So an integrated institution means that there's a mayor or a local leader, there's a public provider, and the public provider directly is responsible to the local mayor. Example would be most public works departments that you're aware of. Then there are public independent entities, right? So these are entities set up with a parallel structure, and they're also equivalent to parastatals in Sub-Saharan Africa. These were beloved in 19th century America. So the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is one example. The Erie Canal Commission is another. They were thought of being a way of bypassing the corruption at the local level. Now, they can work, but sometimes they don't. Right? So the track record of independent public authorities in the US in the 19th century seems relatively good. The track record of African parastatals does not. And one thing that seems really critical is do you have someone at the top of this public entity that's independent who actually has a lot of reputation to lose by screwing up? Right? And this brings the question that if you're imagining one of these public independent entities that's going to be in Bangalore and led by a giant of the Indian IT industry, then it's quite plausible. Right? This person has a lot to lose. They're going to want to run something properly. And you also will get, and this was a point that Paul made in an article about these about 6 or 7 years ago, you also will get more ability to set the terms of labor agreements in these. There's typically more freedom than if it's directly inside the public sector. Conversely, right, if you have someone who's very weak in these things, who's basically entirely going to be beholden to their political masters, then you get the worst of both worlds. You don't get any actual incentives. All you get is the ability of the politician to say, look, I'm not responsible for the crappy service that you're getting. That's this independent entity that's doing it. So it becomes a tool purely for patronage and corruption rather than for delivering anything. 2 other models. I'll deal with one shortly. One is nonprofit independent. Hey, there is a track record of this, even in infrastructure. In 18th century UK, there were things called turnpike trusts that were run at the local level that were responsible for maintaining roads. Now, the problem with nonprofits is often raising enough capital to actually manage this. You will have softer incentives in this case, but this also means softer incentives to subvert the government. And that's, of course, the problem with for-profit independent entities, the public-private partnership model. And, of course, Eduardo Engel's work is the clearest work on the downsides of PPPs and the upsides. That in governments like Chile that are relatively functional, the ability to manage these PPPs is relatively strong. In other areas, and Sub-Saharan Africa is one of them, they end up subverting the government straight away. Right? So you have a highly motivated private entity that's contracting with a public entity that pays them. In what world does that not lead to subversion of the government if you have a very weak government? I'll just tell a story from my own work on Manila sewers. So in the world of Manila water and sewers, they had somebody, assuredly a McKinsey consultant, come up with this idea of having a private provision of sewers. They had a wonderfully designed auction where the 2 different companies competed to get the lowest return on capital that they could possibly get. So they were down to like a 2.5% return on capital in the official auction. Right? So you think, boy, that's great. They've all agreed to have no profits whatsoever on this, and they're providing it. Within a year, they had renegotiated to 10%. Okay? This is, so once you've done the contract, it all breaks down. So thinking about this type of thing in line with whatever you've got in terms of local incentives feels really important. We've been working, and this is joint work with NAVA, as well as with Bryce Steinberg and Abe Holland, on sewers in Zambia for a while. There are 2 papers I'm just going to mention very briefly on this. One is on the adoption problem in sewers, and the second is the outcome of sewers. So the water problem in Africa is one in which there's often two technologies that are floating around. Let's see if my next slide is on two technologies. No. One of which is a traditional technology, shallow wells, pit latrines. The other which is a fancy technology. And that shows up over and over again. So you think in transport, you have the comparison between jitneys and the Gau train, for example, a fast, sleek train. And often the question is around infrastructure. In what case is the right answer to upgrade the existing infrastructure, and in what case is it to replace it? So I can easily believe that the right answer to transportation is to integrate and make the jitneys safer rather than to build fancy trains everywhere. In sewers, the answer may be a little bit more around actually getting people to move towards sewers. So another paper that I'm working on, and we're not sure what the answer is that one of the things that's different between 19th century sewers and 21st century sewers is that when you didn't put sewers in the 19th century and people got cholera, they died. Okay? When they get other infectious diseases, they died. Now we have antibiotics. They die much less. We also know how to use water hydrotreatment to deal with cholera. But the antibiotics are particularly interesting because that's not externality free. That in fact, if you're constantly letting people get sick from these diseases and treating them with antibiotics, you have the possibility of creating antibiotic-resistant bacteria that then can infect us all. So I'm doing a project with Marcy Alsen, who's a doctor at Stanford, looking at the rise of antibiotic-resistant disease in Hyderabad. The second point, which is somewhat interesting, this comes from a Papers and Proceedings paper with Nava from a year ago, and again, Giacomo Ponsetto, is how do you think about the adoption problem? So one of the big challenges is that you often have a foreign agency which builds the water mains, that builds the connections, and people aren't willing to pay for the actual final connection. So you have a last mile problem. This is not new in the world. The same thing happened in the cities of the now developed world in the 19th century. New York built the Croton Aqueduct in 1842. The city still had cholera epidemics for another 25 years because poor people did not connect. They were not willing to pay for the connection. My own great-great-great-great-great-grandfather died in the cholera epidemic of 1849, 7 years after the Croton Aqueduct was built. The critical element was getting people to connect. Now, we as economists, it's not that they're foolish or, unwise. It's not some issue where some minor information thing is going to change it. It costs $1,000 to pay for this connection, right? Most of the benefits are going to be external, and the external share of benefits are higher with sewers than they are with water, right? Sewers are more likely to, when they're not there, to more likely to cause problems for your neighbors. Clean water is, more likely to bring benefits for yourself. We have two natural mechanisms for dealing with this. One is subsidies. The other is fines. Okay, and this graph is supposed to have along the x-axis is supposed to have the quality of the judicial system. So higher A's mean a better judicial system. This is supposed to be the quality of the executive branch. Higher values of this means a worse executive branch. If you use subsidies, it puts strains on the executive branch because it gives them an excuse to spend money on stupid crap all over the place, and it creates more opportunity for waste in lots of different dimensions. Higher fines create stresses on the judicial system because it creates more scope for corruption and indeed extortion. So the answer is, unsurprisingly, when both of them are good, which is down here, you can use subsidies, but it really doesn't matter. Both things work fairly effectively. If you have a crappy executive system and a great judicial system, you want to use fines entirely. If they're both awful, I'm sorry, you've got to give up, right? People will die, it won't work. The interesting thing that comes out of this is there's a broad range of parameter values in which you want to use a combination. It's a combination that's chosen for a very specific reason, which is you want the fines to be just high enough so you don't get subversion of justice, meaning you don't get it's all right as economists, of course, we're okay with people extracting fines in the form of bribes for ourselves. Maybe we're not morally okay with this, but they're still paying the fines in some way, whether or not they're paying it to the police officer or to the courts doesn't really matter to us. What you really don't want is extortion of the innocent. And when you jack up because that eliminates the incentives as well as being horribly unfair. So what you need is mild enough fines so they only get imposed on the guilty, not imposed on the innocent. So you have a sort of mild fine on this, then whatever you're missing to get adoption, you have to do with a subsidy. And this puts Becker's insight that you want to boil people in oil for double parking on its head. That it's, in fact, it's not the right answer when you have the possibility of subversion of justice, because these larger fines are an invitation. This was a point that David Friedman made in the Journal of Political Economy in 1999, that you want these fines to be small enough so that they don't create extortion, so that they don't create massive amounts of abuse. So it's a world in which we don't think that having, the West certainly didn't solve the last mile problem just with subsidies alone. And I have trouble believing that we're going to solve the last mile problem in the developing world with subsidies alone either, but we need to be sensitive and understand the local conditions if we are going to engage in punishment as well. This is also joint work with Nava. This is on the impact of water going wrong. Our identification here comes from the relatively random timing of water supply breakages in different parts of Lusaka. First thing we're showing you is that there are more cases of diarrheal disease, particularly for young people, reported in areas after their breakages. So for you to believe that this is a random experiment, for this is something that's clean, you have to believe that place A versus place B may not be random at all, but that the fact that place A had a water breakage in April and place B had one in June, you have to believe that that's random. So water breakages seem to be related to more diarrhea, and that's surprising almost because in general, when you have these breakages, you're less likely to go to see the doctor. Okay, and that's an important thing to think about in terms of these health outcomes, that if you're dealing with a water problem, you're less likely to actually have the time free to actually visit an MD. So there's less visits to doctors overall, which we don't interpret as more health. We interpret that as a stress on time. You also see a mild downturn. It's not super strong on the amount of economic transactions that are going on with Zona, so that's the e-money that's going on. We see a downturn in that. So measures of supply issues are related to a significant decrease in the amount of transactions. And then I think most interestingly, we find that kids, particularly young women, end up spending more time on household chores when the water breaks down. And it brings up the issue that in some sense, these failures of infrastructure can have very specific impact on particular people. So who ends up dealing with getting the water from somewhere else? It's the girl. She's sent off to try and bring something to the household. And consequently, these effects aren't statistically significant when you look at this. But the hours, it's a direct offset, right? She's doing less work on her schoolwork. She's doing less homework. She's doing less stuff because she's actually dealing with the water. Okay, one more point on housing and infrastructure. When I think about developing world cities, when I think about developed world cities, there are two rival dangers, a Scylla and Charybdis, if you will, of NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. Basically, all of the Anglo-Saxon countries and their colonies suffer from this sin, and there's monumentalism, right? So I think I have Astana up there as my poster child of building too much. But you might think, in fact, that China is subject to that as well. So this is something to think about. It tends not to be a Sub-Saharan African issue, right? In fact, whatever rules you have on the books in Sub-Saharan Africa, they tend not to bind very strongly. But in terms of these rules. But Mumbai, for example, has suffered for 50 years under some of the most draconian land use regulations in the world, and consequently the city is dysfunctional. It sprawls out instead of building up. It has too little high-density stuff on it. China, on the other hand, has dealt with building dealt with its urbanization by building massive amounts of stuff. And this comes from a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper that's out this year, again joint with Andre, with Yaron Ma, with someone else too, and we're trying to. With Wei Hong. And we're trying to ask ourselves the question as to what's going to happen to the Chinese housing boom. And the point that we're making in this, and this is far away from much of cities that works, but I just want to raise the issue because it's also part of the developing world going forward, is that it's very hard to predict housing crashes off of demand-side factors alone. Where really you knew that Las Vegas was going to crash in 2006 was because there are no boundaries on supply. It's basically deregulated, and there's basically an infinite amount of land. And often, when you think about what price changes are predictable, supply gives you the power to do it. If it costs $80 a square foot to build, now and in the future, then what the heck are prices doing at $300 a square foot? So we've used that insight and then tried to project what's going to happen to housing prices over the next 30 years in China, particularly if it becomes a normal country, so that incomes are 10 times, 1/10 of housing prices. And the answer is, given all but totally unreasonable predictions about income and housing supply growth in third and fourth tier cities, so these are places below Beijing and Shanghai, right? It's almost impossible to imagine that there won't be a significant correction of some form going forward. Beijing and Shanghai are like London. They are restricted, and there, who knows, right? I don't know what the price of a Rembrandt will be in 30 years, and I don't know what the price of a Belgravia mansion will be anymore. They're not making them anymore, and consequently, it's purely demand side. Firms and employment. I actually think that this is an area in which it's a great area for research. It tends to be an area in which it's less likely that we're going to be able to give great policy advice. Maybe around regulation. Certainly, we're not necessarily going to be great in terms of telling firms how to do things better. It tends to be a rich area and a natural area for economists, but I want to push slightly against our tendency to focus on firms and employment relative to, yes, you guessed it, sewers, right? The question of how agglomeration works in the developing world is incredibly interesting, even if getting the policy puzzles right are hard. Now, I have spent numerous hours, right, reading and puzzling over John Sutton's marvelous enterprise maps in the developing world. And I think, for any of you who are interested in this world, they're a fantastic starting point for just thinking about what things we don't understand in sub-Saharan African enterprise. The role that urban economists start with this is what role do cities actually play in growth, which is also an interesting, important question. Governments actually want to know how to increase employment and productivity, and I think in general we have much less to tell them. We typically like education. We like some types of deregulation, although I hope you've noticed that there are some areas like sewers where we may well need more regulation rather than less. And some infrastructure. We are typically less fond of industrial policy, but again, I think that the role of being somewhat agnostic in these areas is reasonable. We do know, if you looked at poor countries in 1960, that urbanization is strongly predictive of subsequent growth. I have no idea if any of this is remotely causal. I'm certainly not trying to convince you it is. But understanding this better is important. Understanding this is the relationship between population density and income within countries for India, Brazil, China, and the US. The correlations are at least as strong in these other countries as they are in the US. Understanding these agglomeration effects are important. But again, I'm not totally sure where the right place to go is on this, but it remains an interesting thing. This comes from work that again appears in this OXREP paper with Wen Tao. This is looking at the relationship between population density and mean labor productivity. And what you see is that prefecture population density is strongly correlated with labor productivity within industries across prefectures in China. So again, things like agglomeration economies appear to be quite strong in China. What we then set out to do was to try and understand which industries agglomerated. So we have 4 different potential measures of agglomeration here, one of which is just how concentrated the industry is. So this is how much the industry locates in space. And we're looking at 3 different variables on this, one of which is how information intensive the industry is, which we proxy with share of the employees with college degrees. The second of which is how costly is the industry to transport, and we proxy for this with weight to value. That's the conventional measure. So is the product heavy, like slate, or is it light, like Swiss watches? And then how export oriented it is. So the first thing to notice is just concentrated industries in China tend not to be more educated ones. They do tend to be ones with high weight to value are less concentrated, meaning they tend to be spread out, presumably close to customers, because in fact it costs a lot to move these goods. And finally, they tend to be export-oriented industries. And that's often because they are specifically concentrating in export-oriented zones. The second measure of concentration that we look at is the correlation between density and how employed this is. So this is the population density of the area and how much employment there is in this industry. So this is asking, is this industry tend to locate in areas with lots of population density? Okay? And so what this is telling you is, again, no education coefficient. This is telling you that the places with high weight to value are slightly less likely, and this is telling you that the export-oriented industries are much more likely to locate in places with high population density. And these also tend to be these coastal cities that tend to have high access to outside markets. This is the correlation between employment and labor productivity. So this is asking whether or not are the places where these places are really agglomerated, do they show lots more productivity? So this is a third measure of this. Here, the education effect is huge. So this is where education really shows up. So if you're asking yourself, in which industries is this relationship, again, the relationship between density, actually this is population density, not the density of the thing, is this stronger? The answer is the educated industries are the ones that are showing the most agglomeration economies within these specific industries. No relationship with weight and a negative relationship with export sales. The ones that are most export-oriented actually seem to be getting the least extra labor productivity out of this. And this one, none of the coefficients are significant. We'll skip over it. I'm going to skip over this too, which just shows different versions of this. Okay, financing and strengthening city government. We suspect that our most popular output will be giving city governments better ways to raise money. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. We have things to say about this that are not, that come from economic theory. When they're not externalities, economists have long liked the value of user fees. Right? And there's a lot to like about user fees, particularly for things like roads. Local property taxes, when there's no excludability and limited externalities, are also a natural one. But there are also points about subversion and local institutions that argue for different types of ways of raising money. So I'm going to talk particularly about the value of automated property tax assessment. And this is something that Paul Cheshire pushed here in the UK 15 years ago to the great delight of the surveying industry, which loved the idea that he was going to automate them out of existence. But there's a lot to be liked for it, and I think new technologies have made this more plausible. I just mentioned for a second the work that we've been doing on improving the quality of property tax assessments. And there's a lot that you can do if you just have a proper register of arm's length sales, where you actually trust the sales, and just basic characteristics of the place, including location. But you can do even better in a purely automated sense if you have images, right? So now we have Google Street View in much of the world. It's certainly, if you were talking about this problem in Latin America, you have it. If you're talking about it in much of India, you have it. In much of Indonesia. Sub-Saharan Africa, you're really restricted to South Africa, right? That's where you're going. But it will change. The way this technology basically works is you're taking a variable like a property tax, like a property value, a sale price, and you're essentially regressing it on the pixels, okay? So you've got this image, you're going to put it through this mechanism. These are a bunch of words that I barely understand, which is why I co-author with computer scientists. And we figure out how they do. So the work that we've been doing is on Boston property prices, but we're eager to do this for Karachi. We're eager to do this in the developing world as well, where we think it actually has more value. So we have data on homes, and then we're going to be looking at how well different measures work. So the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a horse race between assessor characteristics. This is where there was a guy that went out and marked stuff down about the property, things that you wouldn't know just from actually looking at it. And then we're going to compare this with what I know from Google Street View. And the answer is that the assessor does do better. Okay? With just the assessor, you're getting an R-squared of 13.8%. With Street View, I'm getting an R-squared of 12.8%. Okay? So probably if the assessor was free, you would like to use the assessor. But if I use both of them together, I can get to 20%. So in fact, the Google Street View adds a lot on top of the assessor. If you thought that the assessor was likely to be bribed and your Street View algorithm was not as prone to being bribed, then in fact you probably would be happy with a 12.8% honest relative to a 13.8% bribed. We then can compare a variety of different things for actually getting this. So the answer is that you get a lot of information from Google Street View. It's really almost as good as a human being doing it in different dimensions. And really, the more that we're going to get in terms of vision, the more plausible this is. So implementing a property tax or a land tax with a purely algorithm-based method is certainly within the possibility. It was impossible before this. This just adds a little bit of bells and whistles to this. And when we think about raising money in the developing world and giving developing world cities, I'm going to skip this, developing world cities stuff to do, ways to raise money, thinking about things like automated algorithms to do this is really useful, and it's I think the way forward in lots of things. So with that, let me hand it over to Tony, but thank you again for your time, and thank you for all of you who are interested in developing world cities. There's a lot of work to do, and it needs all of your help. See ya.
Okay, good. Let me completely sort of abuse my position as discussant by not really discussing the paper. I mean, it's phenomenally prolific, as you've seen. My ability to comment on the 28 papers appears to be talked about there is very limited. Zero, in fact. So I will try and be brief, but just talk about a bit about the Cities at Work initiative and some of the slightly perhaps sort of bigger picture stuff here. First, let me say, the Cities at Work initiative, I think, is absolutely fantastic. It's really important. When I think of world issues, I suppose we all think, climate change number one, and then making cities in the developing world work is very much number two on my list of the big issues. And it's an issue where there really needs to be more economics input into it. There hasn't been that much. There should be. There's a lot of value from economics going into it. So Cities at Work is going about that in exactly the right way, trying to harness researchers and engage with policymakers, disseminate the stock of knowledge, and in the ITC tradition also get new work, new research going on. So Cities at Work is going about it exactly the right way. The 4 or 5 topics, or 6, or whatever it is, I think it's 5 in the thing you've got in front of you, are the detailed micro-level issues that we need to understand to make progress. And obviously Ed has given an example, numerous examples of the way on each of these topics, there are many great great economics research topics that have policy relevance. So that's great. That's fantastic. But I actually want to spend a couple of minutes saying, well, okay, we've obviously got to do that microeconomic detail. That's really important. But we also need, I think Cities That Works needs to have a slightly higher level sort of strapline, thinking about cities as economic systems as a whole, thinking about the dynamics of city growth. So I want to say a couple of words about that. I guess you're all in The Economist, so you're all economists here. So my two sort of headings here are one, general equilibrium, and two, dynamics. So I guess everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say general equilibrium. Okay, so it's important to see cities as a whole. Clearly, all the micro bits absolutely essential, but important to see them as a whole. Well, yeah, that's always true. You know, all bits of economic systems fit together. Obviously, the infrastructure determines the housing, which determines the labour supply, which determines firms, which determines income, which determines the tax base, which determines the. That's all obvious. A city is a sort of general equilibrium system where everything hinges on everything else. But I think there's some particular general equilibrium issues in cities that are really, really important and make it different. And that is the potential of cities to either have vicious circles or virtuous circles. There's cumulative causation processes going on. Obviously, if you look at the East Asian cities, the Chinese cities, really booming, prosperous cities, and you look at African cities, essentially stuck in low-level traps. Okay, so the evidence, I think, suggests this huge variation in outcomes in Africa versus East Asia suggests this possibility of the virtuous or the vicious. I think the basic economics certainly suggests it strongly. Infrastructure really matters, and that has public good characteristics. They're increasing returns to scale, the infrastructure provision within firms, in agglomeration economies. So, lots of micro foundations that are going to generate cumulative causation, these things going on. So there's that. And also, of course, some location choices. So some of the ingredients of cities are very, very mobile. Not all, definitely not. If you think about firms, then clearly there are lots of alternative sites where an internationally footloose firm can set up. So very small differences in the policy environment or the competitiveness of a city might mean that it either gets the export industries or it doesn't. So you put all these things together, and you really do get these stories of virtuous or vicious circles. So what I'm saying is, we've got to do the micro detail, but we also have to think of the city as a whole, as an economic system that might be on one sort of trajectory or another trajectory. And policymakers, economists and policymakers, need to think about the effects of their policy actions on that whole. So housing policy will surely influence firms. Infrastructure will influence both. Land use will influence both. So we also have to see the things on. Okay, that's general equilibrium. The other overarching thing that we really have to keep in mind when we think about cities is dynamics. When you look at the urban literature, an awful lot of it doesn't have any dynamics at all. It's just good old comparative statics, so static models, static urban models. Really very, very little modelling work. But of course, you probably know the facts. The urban population in Africa has to build as much urban capital over the next 30 years. Sorry, twice as much over the next 30 years as it has in the whole of previous history. So if that's not about change, then nothing is, right? The secret is in the words, developing, growing, building, right? So we have to have dynamic stories here. Okay, well again, so what? Economists always say, well, dynamics is important, we've got to think about it. particularly in this context, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, you've got to have growth, you've got to have dynamics, but a lot of the decisions being taken are about structures that are very, very long-lived. That has two consequences. One, decisions now have got you in for a very long time, 150 years, 200 years, whatever, you're building life. And also, these are sunk costs. So expectations become absolutely crucial. People will invest if they expect a city to boom, not if they expect it not to. So the dynamics and the expectations fits back to the virtuous vicious circle stuff, right? Different trajectories you can follow. So we really need dynamics for that reason. Second reason why we've got to think dynamics, I think, is that when we think about change, growth, or the change brought about by policy, it's not a comparative static issue. It's about a process of change, right? You do a policy thing, and you don't just snap to a new outcome. There are lots of moving parts on the way. And we've really got to think that through. If you just build a special economic zone, just build the factories. Does that mean it works? That it's successful? That's going to be a successful zone? Well, no. There are going to be lots of stages on the way. If a planner just designs a beautiful city and builds it, right? That's the comparative statics. It doesn't necessarily work. You've got to populate it. You've got to get the firms and the workers and the general equilibrium bits all fitting together in that dynamic context. So again, I want to appeal here for the cities that work, guys, including myself and everyone around here, to think, absolutely, do all the micro detail. It's really rich, as we saw earlier. But also, I think it's very important to get the message out to city mayors that their city is an integrated economic system on some sort of dynamic trajectory, and the decisions they take now will really shape that in the long run. So getting another strapline on top of the 5 topics, a sort of strong narrative of this general equilibrium and dynamics, I think is going to be important too. Okay.
Thank you very much to Mr. Glaeser and Mr. Venables. We now have some time for questions. I suggest, if it's okay with Ed and Tony, groups of 3 questions.
Well, you're the boss.
Yeah, okay. And am I correct, Elizabeth, that we need a mic from the lectern, or we've got a roving? Excellent, thank you. So we've got a roving mic which we'll use for questions, but also probably for Tony if you want to answer anything, because you haven't got to look on.
Okay.
Great. So, who would like to put forward some questions?
So before, I just want to say I agree completely with everything Tony said. So just to be
It's additional. Compliments on substitutes here.
Good. Questions?
We're going to start cold calling if we don't get any questions. Yeah.
Well, maybe I can start with a question.
You better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to go into this question a little bit more about the policy process. So obviously one of the cities that we work with is that we have a relationship with the IGC is the city of Kampala. I think the stat there is that 2/3 of Kampala is yet to be built. So getting the policy right and making whatever decisions are made now are going to have a long run impact. And both you, Tony and Ed, have interacted a lot with city policymakers and national policymakers making urban decisions. And I'm just wondering if you can say a word about your experience of what works and what doesn't work about using this economics research, the evidence that comes from economics research to influence policy, and what works and what doesn't.
So Kampala is an amazing place, and the woman who's the city manager, Jennifer Musisi, is an amazing person, and we're very lucky to have her as part of the cities that work initiatives. I would say I learned things from her, and it's clear that you learn also what she's hungry for, right? So this focus on property tax systems is clearly motivated in part by what she says she needs, that she wants a system that can be relatively robust, can be relatively easy to implement. I would say it's a harder push. You know, what we all want is a partnership with a city leader who we're going to say, boy, we'd really love you to randomize X. Would you mind randomizing X for us? And that tends to be harder to actually put through. So, I mean, it tends to be easiest when there are commodities that they're giving out that are already in short supply, in which you can convince them that randomization is not just good social science, but it's also fair. That language tends to work better. And in many cases, of course, with city leaders in both the developed and developing world, a good story is more powerful than a randomized controlled trial, right? So you often can, something that seems like it makes sense, something that has, relates to a success in the city other than themselves will work better in terms of persuasion. I would just say one thing that I think I learned from Jennifer, and it's a point that is really critical in terms of thinking about city government more generally, is that it is incredibly hard for city leaders to get anybody who nominally works for them to work for them. So we have this concept of soft power, and it's often the case that basically all of hard power in city management is actually soft power. It's actually very hard to get anyone to do anything unless you persuade them in lots of parts of the world. So I remember first realizing this when dealing with the mayor of a major Italian city that we shall not mention, who had high hopes for lots of change in his city. And as far as I could figure out, he had at most 2 people in his entire staff who would do anything that he wanted them to do, right, at most. Whereas in other parts of the world, like in Boston, I can say this because he's sadly no longer with us, but Thomas Menino, who also faced this problem of essentially tenure-protected workers who wouldn't do anything that he wanted them to do normally, he basically had them all frightened to death that he would go after them and their families. In a good way, for the good of the city, you know. I mean, I have a picture of the man on my wall, but there's no question that people were scared. And that was a way of making things effective. So what I learned from city manager Misc was that, you know, what she said, the way that she said she got people to work for her is the first thing she did is she fired everybody. She fired everybody. You had to then get through the car bombs, because that was the inevitable consequence of firing everybody. So it reminds you how much courage it sometimes takes to lead one of these cities. And the coda that she recently gave me on our phone call was, you need to keep on firing people. That's the critical element, is you keep on needing to fire people and then select back your own people. And it sort of reminds you that areas we don't necessarily think about in economics, right? We don't necessarily think about the agency problems being as hard as they are and as poorly captured by formal personnel charts. And in some sense, this is very relevant for those of you who work on informal property rights, right? When you actually, look at whatever the formal institutions, it may look like there are no property rights whatsoever in developing world slums, but there are. Right? Just in the same sense, when you look at whatever you think the formal institutions are around city government, you may think there are certain rules that apply, but they bear no resemblance to the actual reality on the ground. And that's at least something that I've learned from Jennifer.
Yeah. Tony, do you have anything to add on any engagements you have or any cities or governments that you've worked on that you want to add?
Yeah, let me add a couple of things. I mean, one, this is actually in the words, if I can remember them correctly, of Paul Collier, who's done a good deal more policy influencing than most of us. I think his words are, don't preach, don't bribe, don't bully. And they're all very, very important. Going and preaching at people is hopeless. Saying, well, here's a loan if you do this. The bribery strategy isn't much better. But so, if you don't do those things, what follows from that? What do you do? Well, I just have great faith in helping leaders to see the issues a bit more clearly. There's a set of alternatives, there are trade-offs, these are the costs and benefits. So seeing the alternatives, the trade-offs involved, usually with examples, a good sort of narrative about one rather than the other. Examples rather than regressions. And I have a faith that if people see the issues a little bit more clearly, then they're more likely to reach the right conclusions for themselves.
Just on the don't preach thing, it's actually worthwhile thinking for a second about how we use our own knowledge gained from Western cities in the developing world. And I think it's hard, but it's not impossible. And I'll just give an example of this. that if what you're doing is you come to the developing world and say, look, things in London are great, and what it means is you do X, that's a recipe for failure. That doesn't work. If what you say is, look, you know, New York once grappled with the same problem. For 25 years, it had this last mile problem that it totally screwed up doing. This is how New York did it. This is how New York got to it. Let's think a little bit about whether or not there's any lesson in that for your city. That's
Great, thank you both. Question at the back and then Priya. So if we can go to the back first, and then we'll go to Priya.
Thank you. It kind of relates to your last point, actually. I'm really interested to know your thoughts about the role of external influences like aid and donor funders, for example, as they become increasingly city-focused, and what role they'll play in influencing city development, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So, in my experience, becoming increasingly interventionist in terms of actually funding infrastructure or industrialisation strategies, for example.
Great, thank you. And a second question from Priya.
Hi. Yeah, I guess I had two questions. One is something that we've been grappling with as College Cities at Work that would be interesting to hear more of both Ed and Tony's thoughts on, which is whether, in fact, the biggest challenge at the moment is actually engaging with national policymakers, because obviously in a lot of cities, city authorities have the will and they want to make change, but they don't have either the resources or the legal or administrative authority to put in place many of the policies they might want to, for example, formalising land rights or implementing the land property tax system. And then the second question is actually possibly slightly more specific to do with, Ed, you mentioned sort of non-profit providers for infrastructure provision, and I was wondering to what extent you actually think that can be a long-term alternative for government-led provision, particularly for things like transport where there's network effects, and particularly in the context of, Tony, your comments on how the city is a dynamic, generally kind of equilibrium, so how do you work with organisations that are trying to sort of help and supplement government activity but may not have the same long-term goals?
Tony, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, external funders. So I have two comments to give you. First of all, I think in general, the world of development funding, like the world of development economics, has been too focused on rural problems for too long. That's the past, not the future, and it needs to focus much more tilt towards the urban world. There's a parallel mismatch within the world of urban economics. So the world of economics is just as screwed up in that it has been focused entirely on wealthy world cities overwhelmingly relative to developing world cities, with the sole exception, or not the sole, but the primary exception of Vern Henderson, who was arguing for this 15 years ago and deserves a lot of credit for it. So they're both are, you know, the developing world is not urban, the urban world is not development, and that needs to change. Similarly, much of the funding organizations that have been involved in supporting development also are too rural, and that also needs to change. Now, your second question is, will they be a force for good or not? I'm sure their mistakes will be made, but it is our responsibility to make sure that there are fewer of them, right? In some sense, we should be able to influence that world. That world is a world that is culturally akin to us, is often populated with economists, and we have a primary, you know, it is easier to imagine that we have a primary obligation to making sure that the World Bank is being a force for good on this than, you know, than many developing world country governments, which are harder. So those are you know, key influence points we have to be doing our best to influence. The second is Priya's point about should we be thinking about primarily local versus national, well, that's not the right way. She basically, Priya was making the absolutely correct point, which is that in many cases the right audience is national policymakers who need to actually, you know, both put cities on their agenda and think about the right way to, you know, empower cities when appropriate and deal with. And that's exactly right. That often good urban policy does sometimes have to start from the top, and she could not be more right about this. And it often starts with the most basic things. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure Tony has at least this many experiences, that you walk into a national policy making office in the developing world, and you say, great, you study cities, tell me how I stop all these poor people from coming to my city and screwing it up, right? And, you know, just the starting the force of saying, look, that's not the right answer, right? The cities are, you know, the only pathway we know out of poverty into prosperity for your country. Let's think about how to make the downsides of density less painful. Let's not think about how to fence up walls to stop people from coming to the cities. And Priya also asked an interesting question about the long-term role of nonprofit providers. I have trouble imagining a world in which you're looking at a system in which very large amounts of spending need to be given upfront for infrastructure, that nonprofits are the natural form for that. It's just too much money to be trusting to an institution, unless you're talking about one with extraordinarily deep pockets, like the Gates Foundation. But for low-cost interventions in lots of different ways, and small-scale stuff around the edges, by all means, right? Nonprofits bring different things. They have weaker incentives to cut costs and cut quality when cutting quality means cutting costs. Some things are often safer to put together with local governments because they're less likely to engage in bribery. They certainly deserve a place in the ecosystem, and I think that's likely to persist, in part because we think that nonprofit providers have a meaningful role in our ecosystem as well. Right? There's lots of good things to see.
Yeah, let me just add a few things, or possibly repeat a few things. I mean, first, I mean, Ed's point about donors putting more emphasis on urban is absolutely necessary, absolutely right. So the historical, perhaps still current bias to agriculture is just unfortunate. So there should be more emphasis on urban. But then, who do you engage with? Who does the donor engage with? Well, I think in the first instance, it has to be national government, getting national government to see the importance of cities. I mean, but it's hard. I mean, we know in Africa, virtually all major cities are in the hands of the opposition party, not the government party. We know that cities are, in many cases, seen as a threat, yeah, as Ed said. But national governments have to, in my view, need to come to see cities as the real asset. So you have to engage there, but ultimately, city authorities do need more authority and a broader authorizing environment to get things done. And when you start thinking of a city as a whole, you're thinking about all the 5 things on the list. I mean, land, well, that's the Ministry of Lands and the judicial system. You're thinking about industrial policy, you're thinking about firms, you're thinking about housing, well, that's a government ministry, that's the housing ministry. So you've got all these bits of central authority fragmented across various ministries. And then probably rather weak city authority. And power does need to be, someone has to be able to do something integrated in cities.
Great. Another round of questions, thank you. One over here, anyone else? And 2 in the front row there. Thank you, we'll take all 3 together.
Yeah, so my first question kind of goes on that point, and it's how do you balance to sort of give the necessary freedoms to city policymakers to make cities work while integrating them into national macroeconomic policy objectives? I'm thinking, for instance, of the comparison of sort of how Casablanca fits into the Moroccan industrial policy objectives vis-a-vis how Cape Town might not fit into South Africa's industrial policy objectives. So how do you get that done? And then the second question is on secondary cities. I saw an interesting paper by the IDC on secondary cities in Tanzania. So I was just wondering what can policymakers on the national level actually do to encourage sort of the growth of secondary cities, as they're so important to economic development.
Okay, thank you. And then the ladies in the front row.
Thank you. I was wondering if issues around transparency have come up in your engagements with cities, and what turn the discussions have taken there, and how you see that as fitting into your framework. And something that's somewhat related is that when you were talking about local authority financing, I thought that something that would come up would be around the different incentives that different sources of revenue imply with local authorities. And again, especially in the context of cities with a lot of slums and not many property ratepayers, I wonder how that has been discussed.
Thank you. And last question.
Yeah, I was just wondering about informalization and like informal sectors and how that fits into the policy sphere, because one of what you find in most urban, in the developing world, in slum areas are rapid informalization. And do you feel that firms, because you talk about firm development and employment, do firms encourage this informalization through like methods of subcontracting, and so encourage kind of negative externalities in city development?
Can you? I didn't hear the last. I lost the last bit of your question.
How do you remember?
From do I think that firms was something about?
Yeah, I was saying how do firms encourage processes of informalization is basically what I'm asking, because say through subcontracting, are they part of the reason why informalization is so prolific in say developing world cities?
Okay, thank you. We'll do one more round of questions, but let's do these three because there are a couple of sub questions.
Certainly, the first one was on national industrial policy, which is completely in your bailiwick.
I really would not want to exaggerate the tension between the national and the urban. I mean, really, I think, frankly, they coincide. We can always, come up with an example where, there's a race to the bottom between cities, but in practical terms, they're pretty coincident, I think.
That seems fair. And there are a bunch of interesting things that were raised up. Secondary cities. One of the things that does happen, particularly in countries that have relatively weak political institutions, is that you do have overly large primate cities. So I think the fact from a paper I wrote 22 odd years ago on cultivating surfaces explaining urban giants is that cities in unstable democracies or dictatorships, the primate cities, the capital cities, are 40% larger than equivalent cities in stable democracies. And the argument that the explanation I believe then and I still believe now is that stable democracies have institutions that make sure that rents are fairly evenly returned back to citizens no matter where they live. Whereas in unstable countries, there's a strong tendency of transfers to follow power. People who are proximate to power get more transfers, both because they're afraid of riots and because they are influencing the people in the center of power. So the ability of secondary cities to compete is really partially a question of politics and making sure that you have a fair distribution of rents or a fair amount of redistribution. That's at least one thing that I think about in terms of this. The issue of transparency is really interesting, as are the issue of incentives and various forms of taxation. And there's both, obviously, as economists, the first thing we think about are incentives, or the incentives that means for taxpayers, but it's also interesting to think about what incentives do for local government. I also wrote a paper, also assuredly more than 2 decades ago, called The Incentive Effects of Property Taxes for Local Government, which argued that, in fact, a dependence on a property tax base will induce at least sometimes positive incentives for the local government to fight to make its local amenities stronger because it's depending upon that revenue. Of course, it can also induce it to do negative things if we think that, expropriating various people will actually create more property value or other things. So it's something absolutely worth thinking about and worth looking into. Transparency is really interesting, and again, it relates to the question of whether or not you think cities can mobilize citizens to discipline their governments. In some sense, perhaps transparency is a complement to urbanization in the function of creating more popular control over the government. It's something that political scientists are mad for work on transparency. Economists tend to be less so. But it's certainly worth thinking about. It gets to this broad question of thinking about the city as being an information engine, an information machine, and transparency is clearly part of that in different ways. This also relates to the issue that you raised, which is a fascinating question about informality in cities. And of course, we all find the issue of formal firms versus informal firms, the missing middle in terms of firm sizes, to be incredibly interesting. I don't have a clear answer for you on whether or not how important self-dealing is in informality. My starting point on self-dealing is I am amazed that equity investors ever get any money back, given the ease with which self-dealing can occur in this world, and that it's almost surprising that they give anything back to their shareholders whatsoever. Formality doesn't necessarily mean a problem with self-dealing, right? I mean, if you have some way of enforcing debt contracts, you can still have this working as long as the debt contracts are sufficiently enforced. But it does certainly limit the gains to formality. And I thought also the other big issue with formality is the regulatory framework. And indeed, often I feel with developing world, and sometimes the developed world as well, they do far too much government action in areas they have no business being involved in. whether or not it's over-regulating small businesses or over-regulating how new apartments look in different parts of New York or London, and far too little in one of the core jobs of government, which involve dealing with the negative externalities, which are so around us all the time in dense environments.
Let me just come in briefly on the mega cities and say the secondary cities. I mean, Ed's given a political economy story, which I think is important. But I think there's a more sort of fundamental economic story here. I mean, it's in Britain as well as developing countries, right? That one city is over dominant, and others appear to be struggling and stuck in low level equilibrium. So I really think there's a very fundamental market failure here. Excuse me. And it comes back to the increasing returns, agglomeration, and all that stuff. So it's partly that. And it's partly that once you get within a country, it's absolute advantage, stupid, not comparative advantage. Now, as a trade guy, I've been going around telling anyone who uses the word absolute advantage that they're thick and they don't understand nothing. But of course, comparative advantage works by the prices of immobile factors varying between places. Between countries, that's labour. Fine, within a country, probably not labour a bit, it's land. And land prices can't vary enough to get enough leverage to dislodge the City of London to Sunderland any more than they can dislodge Mumbai to somewhere else. So there are fundamental economic forces that generate this megacity effect, and it's a real policy issue for countries like Britain. It's part of the globalization process that London boomed and other places have their tradable sector wiped out by China, and then you're sort of locked, right? And it's a real problem in developing countries with megacities. It's just hard to get the secondary ones really started, really going. Although ultimately that's where most of the population increase, collectively, secondary cities where it had better be.
Sorry, we had a gentleman in the front row who had his hand up.
Just a very quick
That'll
question.
be our last question.
I would like to ask, is there any role for superstar city in the developing world? For example, you have Shanghai there in China in developing, as part of developing world, but in Africa we don't have any. And in Southeast Asia, we have Singapore as the one of the superstar city, and Jakarta or maybe Kuala Lumpur may want to challenge the status quo by concentrating the resources in their own capital city. So is it advisable for developing world?
Do you mean as in being an example to others?
Yeah, is there any role for superstar city in the developing world?
I mean, the idea of superstar city, the phrase is associated with Chris Mayer and Todd Sinai and Joe Jerko. It's meant to describe U.S. cities that are on a totally different growth trajectory in terms of housing prices. There are two things that people typically think that are required to have that. One of which is something just going totally different in terms of the level of demand for that city. So it can be that its amenities are the best in the country, and you have rising incomes fueling demand for those amenities, or it could be that there's just something different about technological progress in that city taking off. The second of which is you need something about restricted supply. Okay, so you need something, otherwise the prices would come down because they'd build enough units to bring it down. So when you think about those as being the underlying things behind what superstar cities are, you want to think about why they can and might not exist in different parts of the developing world. So it is certainly true that there are cities in China that are just so economically productive and face enough real restraints on construction that they feel like superstar cities, right? Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. Although Beijing, I'm going to stick with my political economy explanations for Beijing's strength more than straight agglomeration, but unquestionably it's a superstar city within the Chinese ecosystem. And certainly Singapore also has, economic strength, and also its political system gives it a comparative advantage in the region as well. In terms of the developing world, I think one of the things to focus on is the rising demand for particularly high amenity cities is more muted, because typically the willingness to pay for urban amenities is a luxury good. So, for example, climate is an incredibly strong predictor of both housing price, particularly of population growth in almost all of the developed world. it's really not much of one in most of the poor parts of the world, where it just doesn't make sense to give up 20% of your income if you're in India to go to a place that has a slightly milder climate, right? You have to be rich before you're willing to do that. So the amenity side of the growth of places like Los Angeles, right, you're not going to see yet. You may eventually see it. The second question is, do you actually have places in which construction is meaningfully curtailed? And that is true at the high end. So the Mumbai story is, yes, formal construction is really meaningfully curtailed by rules and regulations, but not really informal growth. So you sort of have a bit of a superstar phenomenon around the formal real estate in Mumbai, and that certainly is going on. Around the informal stuff, not so much, because the supply constraint doesn't bind. And then there's a larger question as to whether or not which of these cities do we think are going to potentially have long-run growth rates that remain higher than other parts of the country. And I don't know about that. I'm not so sure that New York and San Francisco can guarantee themselves longer run. You know, I think they're likely to be more productive than other parts of the U.S. for long periods to come. I don't know if that's going to mean like rising growth rates and productivity going forward. I have no idea about that. So I think it's awfully hard to predict it.
Great. We're at time, so it just remains for me to say thank you to both Tony and Ed for speaking to us today. Thank you to the IGC team who put this together. And thank you to all of you for coming and for your questions.